Imagine trying to win a drag race in a car that is stuck in fourth gear. The engine screams, but the wheels barely turn. You burn out the clutch before you reach 30 miles per hour. In the 1930s, this was the reality of aviation. We had built massive 1,000 horsepower engines, but we had no way to put that power into the air. We were trapping our pilots in a mechanical cage. Until one engineer decided to build a gearbox inside the propeller. To understand why Frank Caldwell is a mechanical genius, we must first understand the tyranny of the fixed pitch propeller. Throughout the 1920s, propellers were simple. They were twisted pieces of wood or metal bolted directly to the engine crankshaft. They were rigid, unchanging, and from an engineering perspective, they were a nightmare. Why? Because of angle of attack. Think of a propeller blade biting into the air like a screw biting into wood. If the blade is flat, fine pitch, it takes small bites. This offers low resistance. The engine can spin up to high RPMs quickly. This is perfect for takeoff, like first gear in a car. But once you are flying fast, those small bites are useless. The engine hits its red line, but the plane won't go any faster. You are revving the engine to death. So, you twist the blade steeply, coarse pitch. Now it takes big dicks. It pushes a lot of air. This is perfect for cruising, like fifth gear. But if you try to take off in coarse pitch, the air resistance is so high the engine can't reach its power band. It stalls. You crash at the end of the runway. For decades, designers compromised. They built medium propellers. They were terrible at takeoff and terrible at top speed. They were mediocre at everything. By 1930, engines were getting bigger. 500, 600, 800 horsepower. But the planes weren't getting much faster. The fixed propeller was wasting 40% of the engine's potential energy. It was creating drag instead of thrust. Enter Frank Caldwell, the chief engineer at Hamilton Standard. Caldwell was obsessed with efficiency. He knew the solution. The pilot needed to be able to change the angle of the blades while they were spinning. But think about the mechanics of that. The propeller hub is spinning at 2,000 RPM. The centrifugal force trying to rip the blades out of the hub is roughly 20 to 40 tons. How do you build a mechanism delicate enough to twist a blade by exactly 2 degrees, but strong enough to hold back 40 tons of violence? Caldwell didn't use gears. He used hydraulics. He designed a hub with a sliding piston inside it. He used the engine's own oil pressure. By pumping oil through the hollow center of the crankshaft, he could push the piston forward. Connected to the piston were mechanical linkages, counterweights and cams, attached to the root of each blade. When the pilot pushed a lever, oil rushed in. The piston moved, the blades twisted. It was a hydromechanical marvel. But the industry was skeptical. They said it was too heavy, too complex. Another thing to break, they said. Then came the test. The Boeing 247. This was the first modern airliner, all metal, retractable landing gear, 2 engines. It was designed to fly over the Rocky Mountains, but during testing, Boeing realized a horrifying truth. The plane was too heavy. With fixed-pitch propellers, the engines couldn't generate enough RPM to lift the plane safely out of high-altitude airports like Cheyenne, Wyoming. Boeing had spent millions, and they had built a turkey. They were about to scrap the project. Frank Caldwell showed up with his controllable pitch propellers. They bolted them on. The pilot set the lever to take off, fine pitch. He opened the throttles. The engines screamed to full RPM immediately. The blades bit the air with low resistance. The Boeing 247 leaped off the runway in half the distance. Once in the air, the pilot pulled the lever to cruise, coarse pitch. The oil pressure shifted. The blades twisted. The RPM dropped, but the speed increased. The plane cruised over the Rockies effortlessly. Caldwell saved Boeing, but he had done something much more dangerous. He had unlocked the cage. Suddenly, engine designers realized they could build massive, high-compression monsters. They could build the 2,000 horsepower engines needed for war, because now they had a way to use that power. But across the ocean, in Great Britain, the Royal Air Force was sleeping. They were designing a new fighter, the Supermarine Spitfire. It had the perfect aerodynamic shape. It had the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. But the British government, trying to save money, made a fatal decision. They fitted the prototype Spitfire with a fixed-pitch, two-blade wooden propeller. It was like putting wooden wagon wheels on a Ferrari. The test results were depressing. The Spitfire was sluggish on takeoff. It climbed slowly. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 was flying with a licensed copy of Caldwell's variable pitch technology. The Germans could outclimb the British. They could dive faster. War was approaching, and the British were about to send their pilots into combat with one hand tied behind their backs. Frank Caldwell's invention was sitting on a shelf in America, while the fate of Europe hung by a thread. By 1938, Frank Caldwell's two-position propeller was the industry standard. It gave pilots two choices: takeoff, low gear, and cruise, high gear. It was a massive improvement, but it was still crude. It requires the pilot to manually shift gears. In a dogfight, a pilot is busy trying not to die. He doesn't have time to watch his RPM gauge and fiddle with a lever. If he dives, the engine over-revs and blows up. If he climbs, the engine bogs down. Caldwell knew that for the propeller to be a true weapon, it needed to think for itself. Enter the constant speed unit. Caldwell didn't just want a gearbox, he wanted an automatic transmission. He designed a mechanical governor that sat on the nose of the engine. The concept was pure mechanical genius. Inside the governor were rotating flyweights, heavy metal balls spinning with the engine. Here is the mechanics of it. If the plane dives and the engine starts to speed up, the flyweights spin faster. Centrifugal force pulls them outward. This movement physically pushes a valve stem, which opens an oil line. High-pressure oil rushes into the propeller hub, twisting the blades to a steeper angle, coarse pitch. The blades bite more air. The drag increases. The engine slows down back to its target RPM. All of this happens instantly, automatically, without the pilot touching a thing. It was a continuously variable transmission for the sky. Whether the pilot was climbing vertically or diving at 400 miles per hour, the engine stayed at its peak power band, usually 2,850 RPM. The propeller was constantly adjusting, thousands of times a minute, hunting for the perfect bite of air. It was the ultimate efficiency. But in 1940, the British Royal Air Force had a problem. They didn't have it. June 1940. The Nazis have conquered France. They are staring across the Channel at England. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. The RAF has the Spitfire Mark I, but many of them are still fitted with the older two-position propellers, or worse, fixed-pitch wooden ones. The pilots are terrified. They know that against the German Messerschmitt 109, which has a fully automatic constant-speed propeller, they are sitting ducks. The German plane can climb faster. It can dive without blowing its engine. The Spitfire pilot has to throttle back in a dive to save his engine, letting the German get away. June 24th, 1940, weeks before the major attacks. De Havilland, who licensed Caldwell's patent, gets a desperate call from the Air Ministry. Convert them, all of them, now. It is one of the greatest engineering scrambles in history. De Havilland sends teams of engineers to every RAF airfield in Britain. They don't have time to bring the planes back to the factory. They work on the grass, in the rain, under canvas tents. They have to drill holes in the engine bulkheads to run the new oil lines. They have to bolt the Caldwell governors onto the Merlin engines. They are modifying the most sophisticated fighter plane on Earth with hand drills and spanners, often while air raid sirens are wailing. They work 24 hours a day. They sleep under the wings. In just 54 days, they converted over 1,000 Spitfires and Hurricanes to constant speed propellers. The result was instant. The constant speed Spitfire could climb 7,000 feet per minute. But the biggest change was the dogfight. Now, when a German pilot tried to dive away, the Spitfire pilot didn't have to throttle back. He could push the nose down, keep the throttle wide open, and the propeller would automatically coarsen to keep the engine safe. He could stick to the German's tail like glue. The German pilots were shocked. A week ago, the British planes were sluggish. Now, they were performing maneuvers that shouldn't have been possible. The 12 mile per hour increase in top speed was nice, but the ability to use 100% of the engine's power 100% of the time, that was the difference between life and death. Frank Caldwell's American invention, installed by British mechanics in a muddy field, had levelled the playing field. Caldwell had solved the takeoff. He had solved the dogfight. But as the war dragged on, bombers began to fly longer missions. They flew over oceans, and pilots discovered a new, terrifying problem with the propeller. If an engine died in mid-air, the propeller didn't just stop. He became a killer. It turned into a giant air brake that could flip a bomber upside down in seconds. By 1943, Frank Caldwell's constant speed propellers were on every Allied fighter. They were winning dogfights, but for the bomber crews flying B-17s and B-24s, the propeller had a dark side. When an engine was hit by flak and died, it didn't just stop. The rushing air hits the flat blades and forces them to spin. It's called windmilling, and it is terrifying. A windmilling propeller isn't producing thrust. It is a massive parasite. It acts like a giant air brake on one wing. The drag is so immense it can pull the plane into a deadly spin, flipping it upside down. The dead engine didn't just quit, it tried to kill the rest of the plane. Frank Caldwell knew that the only way to save the crew was to stop the windmill. But the air forces on the blades were massive, tons of pressure spinning the dead engine. Caldwell needed a way to turn the blades 90 degrees, edge on to the wind. He called it feathering. Think of it like a knife. If you slap water with the flat of a blade, it stops dead. If you slice it with the edge, it slips through effortlessly. Caldwell designed a panic button in the cockpit. When the pilot hit the feather button, an auxiliary electric pump screamed to life. It bypassed the normal governor. It pumped high-pressure oil into the hub, forcing the piston past its normal limits. The blades twisted all the way to 90 degrees. They streamlined. The wind caught the edge, and the propeller simply stopped. The drag vanished. The effect was miraculous. A B-17 with two feathered engines could still fly. It could limp home across the English Channel. Without feathering, those planes would have spiraled into the ocean. Thousands of airmen returned home to their families solely because Frank Caldwell figured out how to make a propeller turn sideways. The war ended. The jet age began. Frank Whittle's jet engines didn't need propellers. They used internal turbines. For a moment, it looked like Caldwell's invention was obsolete. But the laws of physics are stubborn. Jets are fast, but they are thirsty. For short-haul flights and cargo, you still need the efficiency of a propeller. So, engineers took the jet engine and bolted a Caldwell propeller to the front of it. The turboprop was born. Look at a modern C-130 Hercules. Look at the Dash 8 that flies you to regional airports. They use massive, multi-bladed propellers. And inside the hub, you will find the great-grandchildren of Frank Caldwell's mechanism. Governors, counterweights, oil pistons. The computer controls it now, but the mechanics are exactly the same. The gearbox of the sky never went away. It just got smarter. Frank Caldwell is rarely mentioned in history books. He didn't build the engine, like Rolls-Royce. He didn't build the airframe, like Mitchell or Johnson. He built the link between them. He was the man who realized that power is nothing without control. Every time you see a plane take off, watch the propellers. Watch them bite the air. That is the invisible hand of Frank Caldwell, shifting gears so we can touch the clouds. The engine provides the muscle. The wing provides the lift. But the propeller? The propeller provides the grip. For 40 years, if you saw a UFO over the Nevada desert, chances are you didn't see an alien. You saw the mind of Kelly Johnson. He built planes that flew higher than the atmosphere and faster than a rifle bullet. He built ghosts. He was the most secretive engineer in American history, and it all started in a smelly circus tent next to a plastic factory. Clarence Kelly Johnson was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was the son of Swedish immigrants born in a remote mining town in Michigan. He was poor, he was tough, and he was brilliantly, arrogantly intelligent. At school, they bullied him because of his name. He fought back. In fact, he fought so hard they gave him a nickname, Kelly. He carried that fighting spirit into the polite, reserved world of aviation engineering, and he shattered it. 1933. Johnson joins the Lockheed Corporation. He is 23 years old. Most junior engineers keep their mouths shut and fetch the coffee. Not Kelly. On his very first assignment, he looked at the senior designer's model for the Electra airliner and told him, "This is unstable. It's rubbish." The senior engineers were horrified. Who was this kid? But there was a problem. He was right. Johnson fixed the design. The Electra became a legend. And suddenly, Lockheed realized they had a tiger by the tail. By 1937, war was brewing. The US Army needed a fighter. But they didn't want just any fighter. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor. The requirements were absurd. They wanted it to fly at 360 miles per hour and climb like a rocket. Every other company said, it can't be done with one engine. So, Kelly said, fine, I'll use two. He designed the P-38 Lightning. It was a radical beast. Instead of a fuselage, it had a central pod for the pilot and guns, and two massive booms for the engines and turbo superchargers. It looked like two planes welded together. Critics called it ugly. They called it a monstrosity. But when it flew, it didn't just fly. It screamed. It was the first fighter to top 400 miles per hour. It was so fast that it encountered a new, deadly phenomenon that no pilot had ever faced before: compressibility. As the plane approached the speed of sound, the air couldn't move out of the way fast enough. It formed a shock wave. The controls would freeze. The plane would dive into the ground, killing the pilot. It was a terrifying mystery. The sound barrier wasn't just a wall, it was a graveyard. Kelly Johnson didn't sleep. He worked the problem. He designed dive flaps, a simple metal strip to disrupt the shockwave. While other engineers were guessing, Johnson was calculating. He saved the plane, and the plane saved the war. The P-38 was the plane that shot down Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. Did you know the mission was flown in total radio silence? 1943. The P-38 is dominating the Pacific, but in Europe, a new threat has emerged. Reports are trickling in from intelligence agencies. Germans have something new. A plane without propellers. The Messerschmitt Me-262. The US Army Air Forces panicked. They were fighting a jet war with piston engines. They were bringing a knife to a gunfight. Enter the Americans' desperation. The Air Force calls Lockheed. They need a jet fighter, and they need it yesterday. They ask for a meeting. They tell Kelly Johnson, "We need a jet prototype. How long will it take? 2 years? 3 years?" Kelly looks at them. He doesn't blink. "I'll give you a jet in 180 days. The room went silent. 180 days was impossible. It takes 180 days just to design the landing gear. But Johnson had a condition. He said, "I can do it, but you have to leave me alone. No bureaucracy, no inspections, no interference. I pick the team, I pick the hours, and nobody, absolutely nobody, tells me how to run my shop." The general agreed. But there was a catch. Lockheed was busy building bombers. There was no space in the factory for Kelly's secret project. So they improvised. Kelly rented a circus tent. He found an old machine shop next to a smelly plastics factory. The stench was unbearable, a mix of burning plastic and rotting chemicals. One of the engineers, wearing a gas mask, made a joke. He answered the phone. "Skunk works!" a reference to a moonshine factory in a popular comic strip. The name stuck. The Skunk Works was born. Johnson handpicked 23 engineers, the best of the best. He laid down the law. He created the 14 Rules of Management. Rule number 12. There must be mutual trust between the military and the contractor. Rule number 13. Access by outsiders strictly restricted. He created a cult of speed. Be quick, be quiet, be on time. The clock was ticking. They had no computers, no calculators, just slide rules and intuition. They worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Kelly Johnson was everywhere. He was checking rivets. He was shouting at suppliers. He was sweeping the floor. On day 130, the engine finally arrived. It was a British engine, the Goblin, supplied by none other than Frank Whittle's company. Yes, history is connected. Day 143, 37 days ahead of the impossible schedule. The XP-80 Shooting Star was ready. They towed it out to a dry lake bed. The desert sun beat down on the fuselage. The pilot climbed in. The British engine whined to life. Kelly Johnson stood by the side of the runway, chewing on a cigar. He had bet his entire reputation on this moment. It flew. It was the first operational American jet fighter. It was sleek, it was fast, and it was built in a tent by a bunch of rebels who ignored every rule in the book. The army was ecstatic. They ordered mass production immediately. Kelly Johnson hated bureaucracy. Do you think modern innovation is slowed down by too many rules? Let me know your thoughts. But for Kelly Johnson, the P-80 was just the appetizer. The war ended before the plane saw much combat. The Nazis were defeated. But a new enemy was rising in the east, the Soviet Union. And this new war, the Cold War, wouldn't be fought with guns. It would be fought with secrets. The government needed eyes in the sky. They needed a plane that could fly so high that Russian radar couldn't see it. Kelly Johnson was about to receive the phone call that would change aviation forever. He was going to build the U-2. But this time, the challenge wasn't speed, it was altitude. And the pilot wouldn't be a soldier, he would be a spy. Kelly Johnson had proved he could build a jet faster than anyone else. But the world was changing. The Nazis were gone, replaced by a silent, brooding enemy, the Soviet Union. America was blind. The Soviets had tested an atomic bomb in 1949. Stalin was building missiles, but nobody knew where, and nobody knew how many. President Eisenhower needed eyes inside Russia, but sending a plane over Soviet territory was an act of war. Unless the plane was so high they couldn't touch it. Enter the CIA. They didn't want a fighter, they wanted a spy. They approached the Air Force with a radical idea, a plane that could fly at 70,000 feet. To put that in perspective, airliners today cruise at 35,000 feet. 70,000 feet is the edge of space. The sky turns black. The curvature of the Earth becomes visible. At that height, Russian radar would struggle to track it, and their missiles would simply run out of fuel trying to reach it. The Air Force said it was physically impossible. The air is too thin to support wings. So the CIA rang Kelly Johnson. Kelly didn't argue. He simply redesigned the aeroplane. He took the fuselage of a fighter jet and bolted on massive glider-like wings. He called it the CL-282. The CIA called it the U-2. But there was a problem. To reach that altitude, the plane had to be incredibly light. Every gram mattered. Kelly was obsessive. He removed the armor. He removed the ejection seat system. He even removed the landing gear. He designed pogo wheels, stabilizers that fell off the moment the plane took off. To land, the pilot had to balance the plane on a central bicycle wheel like a circus act. It was dangerous. It was fragile. It was essentially a flying camera made of tinfoil. But where do you test a secret plane that doesn't officially exist? You can't fly it at a public airport. Kelly looked at a map of the Nevada nuclear test grounds. He found a dried-up salt flat called Groom Lake. It was remote. It was hostile. It was perfect. He called it Paradise Ranch to trick the workers into coming. Today, we know it by a different name, Area 51. Kelly Johnson didn't just build the plane, he built the base. Area 51 is now the most famous secret base in the world. Do you think the government is still hiding advanced technology there today? August 1955. The U-2 flies. It climbs to 70,000 feet. The pilots, wearing partial pressure suits because their blood would boil if the cabin depressurized, looked down on the world like gods. For 4 years, the U-2 was invincible. It flew over the Soviet Union with impunity. It photographed bomber bases, missile silos, and submarine yards. The Russians could see it on their radar, but they could do nothing. Their MiGs would stall trying to reach it. Their missiles exploded miles below. Kelly Johnson had built a ghost. But technology never stands still. May 1st, 1960. Pilot Francis Gary Powers is flying deep over Sverdlovsk, Russia. He feels safe. He is untouchable. But the Russians had developed a new missile, the SA-2 Guideline. And they didn't just fire one, they fired a barrage. A shockwave from a nearby explosion snapped the U-2's fragile long wings. The plane disintegrated. Powers didn't die. He bailed out and was captured. It was a geopolitical catastrophe. The United States was caught red-handed spying. The invincible plane lay in pieces in Gorky Park. Kelly Johnson watched the news in horror. His creation hadn't failed. Physics had just caught up with him. He realized that altitude was no longer a shield. If you can't hide up high, there is only one other way to survive. You have to outrun the bullet. The CIA came back to the Skunk Works. They were terrified. They can hit us at 70,000 feet, they said. What do we do? Kelly Johnson leaned back in his chair. He had already been thinking about this. We stop floating, he said, and we start sprinting. He proposed a plane that would fly at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound, faster than a rifle bullet. A plane so fast that by the time the enemy radar detected it, it would already be gone. But at Mach 3, the friction of the air is so intense that aluminium, the metal all aeroplanes were made of, would melt like butter. The plane would have to be built out of something else. Something incredibly rare, incredibly hard to work with, and incredibly expensive. Titanium. There was just one problem. The United States didn't have enough titanium. Do you know who did? The Soviet Union. In one of the greatest ironies of the Cold War, the CIA set up fake companies to secretly purchase the titanium from Russia. The Soviets were selling the very metal that Kelly Johnson would use to build the spy plane designed to defeat them. Project Oxcart. It looked like a dagger. It leaked fuel on the runway because the metal panels were designed to expand only when hot. It was the most difficult engineering challenge in history. They had to invent new tools just to cut the metal. They had to invent new fuel that wouldn't explode at 400 degrees. Kelly Johnson was pushing his team to the breaking point. But he wasn't just building a plane, he was building a legend. 1964. The Skunk Works has built the successor to the U-2. It is sitting on the tarmac at Area 51. It looks like a spaceship. But there is a problem. It is leaking fuel. To an outsider, it looks broken, a disaster. But to Kelly Johnson, it is perfect. You see, this plane is designed to fly so fast, over 2,000 miles per hour, that the friction of the air will heat the titanium skin to 500 degrees Celsius. The metal will expand. The panels will stretch. If you built it tight on the ground, it would rip itself apart in the air. So, he built it loose. It only seals itself when it screams. The SR-71 Blackbird. The pilots who flew it didn't wear flight jackets. They wore spacesuits. They were flying at the edge of space, 3 times the speed of sound. At that speed, you are faster than the rotation of the Earth. You can watch the sun set, turn the plane around, and watch it rise again in the west. It was the ultimate engineering paradox, a plane that was fragile on the ground, but invincible in the sky. Kelly Johnson had solved the missile problem with brute force physics. The standard operating procedure for an SR-71 pilot when a surface-to-air missile was detected was simple. There were no fancy maneuvers, no banking, no diving. The pilot simply pushed the throttle forward. The Blackbird would accelerate. The missile, travelling at its maximum speed, would try to intercept, but the plane was moving so fast that the missile would simply run out of fuel and fall back to Earth. It was the only aircraft in history that could outrun a bullet. But building the ultimate plane took a toll. Kelly Johnson ran the Skunk Works like a dictator. He was known for his nickel tour. If an engineer made a mistake, Kelly would walk up to him, flip a nickel onto his desk and say, "Call your wife. Tell her you've been fired." He was brutal. He was demanding. But his team loved him because he protected them. When the Air Force generals tried to interfere with the design, Kelly threw them out. When the bureaucrats tried to cut the budget, Kelly threatened to quit. He built a wall around his engineers so they could do the impossible. As the 1970s rolled in, the world changed again. Radar was getting better. Speed was no longer enough. The Soviets were building faster missiles. Kelly knew the era of faster and higher was ending. The next era would be invisible. Before he retired, he laid the groundwork for the next revolution, stealth. He passed the torch to his protege, Ben Rich. But the DNA of the Skunk Works, the secrecy, the speed, the can-do attitude, that was all Kelly. Kelly Johnson retired in 1975. He had designed 40 aircraft. He had won every aviation award in existence. He had advised presidents. But without the pressure, without the deadlines, without the smell of jet fuel and titanium, he faded. He once said, "I'll design an aeroplane for you, but I won't suffer fools." In retirement, he watched as the aviation industry became bloated, slow, and bureaucratic, everything he hated. The man who built a jet in 143 days watched as new planes took 20 years to develop. In 1990, the SR-71 was retired. On its final flight, it broke one last record. It flew from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. in 64 minutes. The pilots walked out of the cockpit and handed the flight log to the Smithsonian Museum. The ink was still wet. Kelly Johnson died that same year. It was as if he and his greatest creation were tied together by an invisible string. When the bird stopped flying, the master stopped breathing. Today, if you visit the Smithsonian, you can stand under the Blackbird. You can see the titanium skin that rippled at Mach 3. You can see the leak points. It looks like science fiction, but it wasn't built by aliens. It was built by a poor boy from Michigan who refused to listen to the word impossible. Kelly Johnson didn't just build planes, he built the future. And he did it in a tent, with a slide rule and a promise. Be quick, be quiet, and be on time.